According to one of the most discussed teachings in history, there is an error that can never be forgiven, and many people fear they have committed it without even knowing. Throughout history, scholars, religious leaders, and ordinary people have debated this idea, trying to understand if it is a literal warning, a profound metaphor, or something completely misinterpreted. The problem is that misconceptions and out-of-context phrases have created fear, confusion, and even crises of conscience in many people. You will discover where this statement came from, what it truly means within its historical setting, and why understanding it correctly can completely change the way you view guilt, forgiveness, and responsibility. Imagine hearing from Jesus himself that there is an error that will never be forgiven. This statement is recorded in the Gospel of Mark, chapter 3, when he declares that all sins and blasphemies can receive forgiveness, except for one specific one. Researchers of biblical history, such as those linked to the University of Cambridge and the Institute of Jewish Studies in Jerusalem, explain that such phrases were typical of Jewish teachers using strong contrasts to teach serious truths. The central point is not just in the isolated phrase, but in the moment it was spoken. Many readers over the centuries have interpreted this passage without observing the historical, cultural, and narrative context, leading to unnecessary fears and strange theories. Ancient documents show that rabbis used to teach by responding to accusations or provocative questions, not speaking into a vacuum. This indicates that this declaration arose as a response to a specific situation, not as a general threat to humanity. So the question arises, what exactly happened that day to motivate such a solemn warning? The scene begins tensely. A possessed man, blind and mute, is healed before the crowd, and the silence of astonishment lasts only a few seconds. According to the Gospel of Matthew, witnesses were amazed because the man immediately began to see and speak, something impossible for the medicine of the time. Historians like Geza Vermes, a specialist in first-century Judaism, explain that accounts of exorcism were common in Jewish tradition, but such instantaneous healings were seen as a direct sign of divine action. The atmosphere was one of messianic expectation, as many Jews were waiting for a deliverer promised in the scriptures. However, instead of collective celebration, a shocking accusation emerged, and it was this accusation that turned a miracle into an improvised courtroom. Some religious leaders, identified in the texts as the Pharisees, declared that the power came from Satan, not from God. This accusation was not light. In Jewish culture, attributing something divine to evil was considered a very grave distortion of spiritual truth. Rabbinic writings preserved in the Talmud show that religious leaders had the authority to evaluate spiritual signs, which made their declaration even more serious for the people. The miracle was before their eyes, but their conclusion went in the opposite direction. Now comes the turn that many people do not notice. The warning does not describe an impulsive slip, but a continuous posture. Several classical interpreters, such as Augustine of Hippo, argued that this error is not a word spoken without thinking, but a persistent decision to reject what the person recognizes as true. The reasoning appears in ancient commentaries preserved in European monastic libraries, where monks copied biblical analyses line by line. This shows that, from very early centuries, the dominant interpretation already pointed to an internal attitude, not just an external act. Centuries later, the medieval philosopher Thomas Aquinas reinforced this reading by writing that this sin happens when someone deliberately resists the truth even after understanding it. In simple language, it is not stumbling on the path, it is deciding not to walk, even knowing which is the right direction. Historians of theology confirm that this explanation became a reference in Christian schools in Europe between the 12th and 15th centuries, influencing catechisms and sermons. This creates a crucial distinction between honest doubt and conscious rejection, a difference as great as asking and mocking. Jesus' speech then stops sounding like a mysterious threat and begins to function as a spiritual diagnosis. But is there practical evidence of this attitude happening before him? It was not an isolated episode or a momentary misunderstanding. The records show a pattern. In the Gospel of John, for example, religious leaders appear questioning, testing, and trying to discredit Jesus repeatedly, even after public signs described as extraordinary. Academic studies of historical criticism, such as those published by the Society of Biblical Literature, point out that the Gospels preserve independent traditions that agree on this portrait of constant opposition. This suggests that it was not sincere doubt, but growing resistance. The more evidence emerged, the more rigid their posture became. And this escalation did not go unnoticed. Parallel accounts indicate that members of the Sanhedrin, the main Jewish religious council of the time, were already discussing ways to silence him long before the crucifixion. Historical documents, such as the writings of Flavius Josephus, confirm that this council had significant political and religious power in first-century Judea, which made their decisions extremely influential. In other words, it was not just theological disagreement, it was organized, institutional opposition. Their insistence in the face of signs that the people saw as divine reveals a hardened disposition, almost like someone plugging their own ears so as not to hear music they know is playing. The word used in that warning carries more weight than it seems at first glance. In the ancient Jewish world, blasphemy did not simply mean saying something wrong about God in a moment of anger. According to legal records preserved in the Mishnah, the term described a conscious and serious offense against the divine character. In modern terms, it was something comparable to forging the signature of a head of state and still claiming he authorized it. Experts in religious history explain that accusations of blasphemy could lead to formal trials in ancient Israel. This shows that the word had legal, moral, and spiritual weight at the same time. Contemporary scholar Brant Peter, known for his research on first-century Judaism, highlights that to blaspheme was to attribute to God something unworthy, or to attribute to evil what was recognized as divine action. In academic lectures and books published by theological publishers, he demonstrates that the concept always involved conscious intention, not a verbal accident. Think like a judge evaluating evidence. The act is not enough. The motivation matters. This distinction helps separate common human error from deliberate rebellion. Thus, that warning stops looking exaggerated and begins to sound like a precise diagnosis of a specific attitude. Not every spiritual offense has the same weight. In the Gospel of Luke, there is a distinction between speaking against the Son of Man and speaking against the Spirit, something that has intrigued readers for centuries. Scholars of biblical languages, such as those at the University of Oxford, observe that the contrast does not suggest inferiority between divine persons, but a difference in function. The idea is that, during his earthly ministry, many did not immediately recognize who Jesus was, and this could happen due to human limitation. Theologian Don Carson, an international reference in New Testament studies, explains that the Spirit is presented in biblical texts as the one who convinces the human conscience of the truth. In his academic commentaries published by Eerdmans, he states that resisting this action is to refuse the very means by which someone could repent. According to him, it is not a greater offense in gravity, but more definitive in consequence. This explains why the warning sounds so absolute. Before becoming a symbol of faith, he was synonymous with persecution. Paul of Tarsus, initially known as Saul, appears in the Book of Acts of the Apostles, approving the imprisonment and punishment of Christians. Historical sources and academic analyses agree that he was part of a rigorous group of Pharisaic Judaism, trained to defend religious law with extreme zeal. He himself admits, in letters preserved in the New Testament, that he persecuted followers of Jesus with violence. In other words, if anyone seemed a candidate to cross any spiritual limit, it was him. According to the account preserved in Acts and confirmed in his epistles, Paul claims to have acted in ignorance and unbelief before radically changing his life. Theologians and historians point out that this phrase is crucial, as it indicates an absence of conscious rejection of the truth. He did not believe he was fighting against God. It is like someone who puts out a fire thinking it is dangerous, without knowing they are putting out the very light they needed. After his conversion, he became one of the main spreaders of the Christian message in the Mediterranean world. This became a classic argument among scholars. If even a violent persecutor was forgiven, then the unforgivable error cannot simply be a single grave act. If it is not the gravity of the act, then what really defines this spiritual limit? After all this journey, the warning stops sounding like a cold sentence and begins to look like a medical alert full of care. Ancient and modern interpreters agree that this extreme error is not stumbling, doubting, or questioning. It is hardening the heart in a definitive way, refusing the truth even when it becomes clear. Pastoral leaders and biblical commentators explain that those who fear they have committed this sin already demonstrate spiritual sensitivity, the opposite sign of the conscious rejection described in the texts. Therefore, the teaching was not given to cause panic, but awareness. And awareness, when well used, is an open door, not a closed one. This reading matches the message of hope found in the book of Isaiah, where the poetic image of sins red as scarlet, becoming white as snow appears, a symbol of complete restoration. Researchers of Hebrew literature state that this metaphor was used to convey the idea of total, not partial, purification. This reinforces an essential point. Divine forgiveness is presented as broad, available, and insistent, except when the person themselves rejects it until the end. In other words, the only definitive barrier would not be guilt, but the refusal of the remedy. This makes us reflect: is the limit in God, or in the human decision not to turn back?